an honor to be part of the Chappaqua Library offerings and being able to offer this program. And we've had wonderful speakers. You will hear our upcoming speaker on really timely topics. And somehow, with the way news is going, every topic that we take in when we were planning it has turned out to be extremely timely, and so much so that it is good that we're doing these programs live because our speakers may have planned one thing when we were talking to them. By the time they're actually speaking, the news has changed and their presentation and orientation may also have to change. So thank you to our speakers and also to our own team who work very hard to provide these programs. They are with me today, Naomi Marrow, Carolyn Resnick, and Tyler Beebe. One of our members, Amy Friedman, is teaching her class today at this time. So today we turn our eyes to the Americas, especially Venezuela and Latin America as well. While it seems, as I was saying to Stephen Kaplan, we weren't looking, China has been growing its influence here. And as the Trump administration is now trying to look at where their priorities are, he's looked at the Americas as the sphere of influence that the United States should be particularly strong. And so for this, we now do look more closely at Chinese influence, and then whether or not this is a threat to the United States, and if it is, then how does the U.S. counter? And then how does the U.S. involvements in Venezuela, Cuba, possibly the emergency loan in Argentina, what exactly is this part of that strategy? And then what are the implications of other economic factors such as tariffs in the whole strategy of the United States in looking at how do we increase our role in Latin America? So we are very fortunate to have Stephen Kaplan with us as our speaker. He teaches and writes on China's investment in developing countries, especially Latin America, and he has 2 award-winning books in this area. So we also sent out, kindly provided by Stephen, 2 articles for you to read. We hope you had. I think it will give you an excellent background. If you haven't, then Leslie, could you also include that in the chat so that if people haven't had a chance, they can look at it.
Yes.
So before I thank you. So before I turn the program over to Carolyn, who is our host for the day. Our speaker will speak for about 35 minutes. We'll then continue with questions, first from our panelists and intermixed with you, if you would kindly ask your questions in the chat. We have an end time around 11:15. So please enter your questions then. We welcome them. Our program, as we said, was recorded. It is archived on the Chappaqua website under the events tab and then foreign policy. So Carolyn, to you, would you please introduce our speaker?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, June. Thank you, Stephen, for coming. This is marvelous. And I had proposed a while ago that we should find a speaker on Venezuela and then went looking, and I think I have found the perfect person. Stephen Kaplan is an associate professor of political science and international affairs at Institute for International Economic Policy, Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, very prestigious institution, and we've had a few other speakers from them, and we're delighted. His research focuses on the frontiers of international and comparative political economy, global finance, and development. He's written numerous articles. He's written 2 books, both of them published by Cambridge, Globalizing Patient Capital, The Political Economy of Chinese Finance in the Americas, and Globalization and Austerity Politics in Latin America. So, Stephen, I'm going to turn it over to you now, and thank you.
Yeah, terrific. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to today's discussion. I'll open by basically looking at what China has been doing over the course of the last few decades in terms of their loans and financing. Thinking about how it compares to particularly, living in proximity to New York and the financial district, how it might compare to Western finance, and then how China's engaging developing countries, right? And what it means for developing countries to basically borrow and finance themselves via China compared to Western financing. Then I'll also be looking and closing a bit, thinking about the Venezuela case and what that has meant, and thinking about some broader implications for the region as well. And then I look forward to your comments and questions afterwards. So to begin with, economists like charts a lot. I consider myself to be kind of somebody who's both in international affairs as well as economics. I worked, actually, speaking of New York, I worked at the New York Fed for a long time, almost a decade, before coming back and doing my PhD. And so here we have the first graph, looks at China as an emerging creditor globally. All right. And what's interesting about this graph is look at our, if you look at 2008, right, and before 2008, what you generally see is that China as a global financer, right, that's kind of the thick line here, isn't too different from other countries that are kind of rising powers like the Brazil, India, South Africa as well. Comparatively, right, during that point in time, you see sort of the usual candidates in terms of global creditors being Germany, United States, United Kingdom, Japan, right? 2008 before, their financing is a lot higher than China. But what we see sort of beginning in the 2008 financial crisis is that becomes an opportunity for China, right? In many countries, beginning with China joining the WTO in 2000 to 2001, trade relationship was formulated, right? Latin America is included, right, where they were predominantly trading with China. There are some regions like Africa that had more of an investment finance relationship earlier than Latin America. But really before 2008, Latin America was primarily trade. And what we see happening as China increases its global footprint, takes this opportunity, right? Again, look what starts happening. The German graph shows it most clearly, right? Germany and other creditors start withdrawing from the globe, and then China starts increasing its own credit, right? So they're kind of moving in to this vacuum, to this withdrawal of financing from Western powers right after the global financial crisis. And it's giving them an opportunity, right? If you think of their model, China's model prior to this time, right? We hear a lot about undervalued currency and so forth, a lot in the news historically about this. The first 10 to 15 years in the WTO, China was certainly using a cheap currency, right, to help sell their exports abroad. But beginning in 2008, once they start to expand their financial footprint, they start to change the model, right? And rather than just using a cheap currency, they in fact start even allowing the currency to appreciate more in order to become more of a creditor globally. So what does this mean broadly? Well, compared to particularly living in New York and thinking about the kind of financial markets we know very well, right? Bonds, equities, a lot of short-term connections via markets. China has capital controls that limits a lot of that. So as a result, a lot of this financing that's also going out is long-term financing, infrastructure financing. How does that connect to the way China is engaging globally? Well, rather than just being a cheap export platform with cheap prices and a cheap currency, as we see that first 10 to 15 years from the WTO to following the global financial crisis, as China expands its footprint, it's doing it with infrastructure financing, meaning China will offer to build cargo railways, hydroelectric plants, nuclear power plants, all kinds of infrastructure along these lines. It's still, right, promoting Chinese firms and exports because, if you have a big cargo railway, who's going to provide the locomotives, the cars, the materials? It's generally coming from China. If it's a nuclear power plant, it's a technology, right, coming from China. If it's, hydroelectric plant, you're talking about the turbines, et cetera, coming from China, right? So there's still an effort to promote Chinese goods internationally, but they're doing it differently, right? Through this infrastructure financing that they have such capacity in at this time, domestically, they start to externalize that capacity, right? So that's the first thing, just thinking about how China's engaging. Bottom line, long-term infrastructure financing following the 2008 financial crisis. Why do developing countries care about this? Why do they want China to build these things? Well, in previous crises, right, generally when developing countries had to engage in austerity or cut budgets, they cut infrastructure, right? So having this willing participant to help finance infrastructure globally, very attractive to developing countries, right? You can also see this graph shows China Exim Bank and China Development Bank and compares it to the World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank up until sort of COVID here. And what you can see is that, starting at a similar point in time and then building, right, once you get to kind of the 2010s here, China Development Bank and China Exim Bank start to surpass what the World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank is doing in the region. A good example, as we'll be talking about later, is Venezuela, as you may have read about in the article as well, starts doing these big state-to-state deals, right? So in other words, China, Venezuela create a fund beginning in 2008, and China starts to capitalize this fund. And when it begins, right, it is joint financing from the two powers. And then Venezuela has a lot of discretion about extending that financing to important projects developmentally within the country, right? And so what you see is a lot of times who's doing this financing? China Development Bank, China Exim Bank, and it's really increasing quite dramatically in the 2010s. You also think of the environment there. In general, right, commodities are also booming in that period of time. So as we'll see in a moment, how's China collateralizing all that commodities, or all the lending? Via commodities, right? Via sort of commodity guarantees, via commodity sales, as we'll look at in more detail in a little bit. But why this is also important is these are official creditors, more or less, right? China Exim Bank, certainly an official creditor. China Development Bank, considers itself commercial, quasi, public, but they're doing kind of a lot of similar projects to China Exim Bank internationally. China Exim Bank, too, you see the numbers so huge there, just a little qualification. Some of that is trade financing, right? And so those aren't all loans. But even when you look at the loans and you combine them with China Development Bank, still larger than World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank. And, right, that's official or quasi-official lenders. So all of a sudden, not only is China's financial footprint expanding broadly, commercially, but also in terms of official creditors, right? So that's very important. So what are the kind of research questions I'm asking? I already kind of highlighted this earlier, but, how different is China's approach to finance from the West? When does China sort of opt to do things discretionally? When might they, go to the IMF? This part, the second question, and the third, to some extent, I'll leave open if there's any discussion or questions in the Q&A. I'll focus more on the first question within this presentation. But there is sort of, particularly post-COVID, these growing questions about what happens with debt, right? Just like United States debt expanded during COVID to pay, right, for vaccines, masks, everything along these lines, social spending. Same thing happened in a lot of developing countries, creating sort of debt distress, right, ultimately, and then creating a question. Okay, now China's a creditor, right? How do you resolve this debt? If China's doing things differently from the West, what do you do about it, right? And so in a system that has no, domestically, if creditors get into trouble or debtors get into trouble domestically in the United States, well, you can be protected from your creditors. Internationally, there's no international bankruptcy court, right? So how do you resolve these issues? So I'll be talking less about that second set of issues, but I'm just flagging it here in case people have questions or ideas along those lines. In general, when we're looking at, well, how does China's financing compare to what the West has been doing? Well, the West, right, as we're familiar with, particularly living in New York City, living in D.C., for the last several decades, policy conditionality has been really key, right? In other words, if a country needs financing, well, IMF bankers may be willing to put up new financing for that country. And in general, when we say a country needs financing, okay, well, if you have important projects domestically that you're investing in, health, education, police, security, whatever it might be, right, you're going to have to fund that. Ultimately, a lot of developing countries don't have the tax revenues, the tax capacity, the domestic financial markets to be able to finance all that. They have to turn internationally. When they do this, folks like the IMF, global bankers, Western bankers are willing to do this, but they want some policy conditions, right? They want to ensure, for example, well, if you're going to borrow money, we want to make sure you can pay it back. You should have sort of a balanced budget, right? You should have certain conditions that you're following to make your debt more likely to be paid back. There's a whole set of policy conditions along these lines, but comparatively, right, China has a policy of non-intervention in domestic affairs and international affairs under the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. Essentially, this means that they don't engage in policy conditionality, right? Now, as we'll see in just a moment, that doesn't mean they don't have conditionality, right? It just means they're not necessarily saying, if we're going to give you new financing, you need to balance your budget. Or if we're going to give you new financing, you need to implement these labor laws, right? They're not doing any of that, but they are doing a lot of commercial conditions, right? And so I have this term called commercial conditionality, as you see here, where, okay, if the IMF is saying, well, we'll lend you money, but you need to be able to repay it, and so we want you to have sort of a budgetary balance to be able to repay it. Well, if China's saying, hey, we don't need that, we're not going to have those conditions, how do they ensure they get repaid, right? And here comes the earlier point about global commodities, natural resources. If you know what China's done domestically in their financial system and how one of the reasons they've been able to grow as much as they have over the last several decades is they've used, right, local governments have used land, right, resources as collateral in order to help grow their economies. So they're kind of externalizing this model. And so even if countries are getting this cheap infrastructure financing, it's usually in exchange and collateralized by commodities or other things, right? Or so the fine print in these deals is very important. So in other words, Venezuela, right, as we're talking about today, what did it do, right? As it expanded, right, had many loans, right, with Venezuela, had many loans from China, and particularly in the 2010s, right? How did it get all these loans? How did it tell China, hey, we'll repay these loans? Well, it said, okay, we'll take our state oil company, right? And our state oil company will sign a contract along with our loan contract that will deliver future oil proceeds, future oil to you in exchange for the loans, right? So effectively, you see Venezuela making pre-commitments of oil export sales to China to be able to have this infrastructure financing, right? Or future commodity deliveries, or also known as oil for loan deals. So essentially, that's a key way, right? Okay, if you're not going to have to tell governments they need to balance their books to be able to repay you, what is China instead doing? They're saying, hey, you got oil in the ground. We want to grow our access for both national security and economics. We want to grow our access to commodities and natural resources globally. Hey, send the oil to us and we'll continue to do this infrastructure financing, right? So that's one type of commercial conditionality. And the other kind is guaranteed contracts, right, for Chinese firms, contractors, and suppliers. This is what I was mentioning earlier, right? In the case of, early on when you had this big China-Venezuela development fund, it was not just investing in oil. Venezuela had more discretion. So it was investing in railways. It was investing in manufacturing plants, refrigerator plants. But, right, if it's building those railways, where's the cars, the locomotives, everything coming from? China, right? So there's also this commercial element. You have the commodities that help mitigate the risk, right? Because you got the collateral there. But then you also have all these contracts saying you're going to use Chinese firms and contractors to do all this infrastructure financing, right? And that's where this idea of market maximization comes in, where essentially China's part of their geoeconomic strategy is to grow, right, their market share abroad. If initially they had a cheap currency and they were selling exports all over the world, now, right, we said, oh, they're using infrastructure financing more, and they're using this cheap infrastructure financing to gain more markets, right? So if you have key strategic markets, oil, nuclear, hydroelectric, whatever it might be, okay, right? If you're using all this Chinese content, that's going to help China maximize markets, right? So if you see the World Bank or a Western bank doing a deal in Latin America, it's usually a bankable deal oriented towards profit maximization, right? But China has a longer term horizon. It's not just about the profits of one company. It's about maximizing market share in an entire sector, right? So that's how I see things as being very different here. And essentially, because you have this market maximization, it's sort of more of a commercial approach. So even, right, I mentioned debt and China's approach to debt relief. If you think of what you know, again, living outside New York City, maybe being in the financial sector, maybe not, but when there's been, over the course of the last few decades, problems with countries being able to repay their debt, right, one solution has often been, okay, we'll have some level of debt forgiveness, but we'll try to write off this debt and have all this policy conditionality and reforms in exchange for it, right? China doesn't like all that. China's institutions don't like, right, forgiving debt, right? They're not as accustomed to doing it domestically. They haven't done it as much internationally. So they're more likely to hold the debt, right, and wait for better times, right? We're seeing that unfold in Venezuela, where since 2016, Venezuela's had a debt moratorium with China, meaning they really haven't been paying back their debt over the course of the last decade through their economic and humanitarian crisis. China's been willing to do that. And if they've been investing, it's in joint ventures to help oil production in the short term, right? So they sort of have this longer horizon as not only influencing their willingness to go out and gain market share, but also keep market share when things go awry. So notice, you know, China has some statements in Venezuela since the U.S. intervention. Hey, this is illegal according to international law. They've had some statements of solidarity, you know, Venezuela, et cetera. But for the most part, they've been kind of sidelines and hedging, right? Because they're hoping in the long run to kind of maintain their foothold commercially in Venezuela, which obviously with the U.S. controlling more oil has greater uncertainty. But nonetheless, they're trying to stay, you know, on the sidelines from some of this political fray, which is also very common for China to do. So that's important to think about. I've done a lot of research and interviews across the globe. I've called my book, as you heard about, it's called China's Patient Capital, this idea that so much of the business, so much of the strategy is very long term. Well, it comes out when I'm interviewing people during my field research from a Latin American standpoint, too. This is a former energy minister, presidential candidate in Ecuador, saying if the IMF intervenes in Ecuador, it adjusts its economy. It changes its economic policy to austerity, right? These policy conditions I was just mentioning that would make it more likely for Ecuador to repay its debt. Now, of course, that helps China, but China's not playing this game, you know, directly on its own, right? Maybe it's willing to let the IMF take the lead with that kind of policy, but it's focused on the long run. And according to this official, its officials come here, clear instructions to secure resources. It's not so important to immediately be profitable. The goal is access to resources. For China, Ecuador is part of a long-term puzzle, right? So again and again, when I'm doing these kind of interviews, the difference between the short-term engagement of Western finance and Western politicians versus this very long-term horizon of China comes up again and again. So just to kind of classify once again more, you know, explicitly here when I talk about commercial conditionality, and I'm going to show some graphs with these in a moment, but there's two kinds, right? One is China's promoting its commerce abroad, right, which I've talked about. And very similar to other countries, they might do this with aid, bilateral aid, Chinese foreign content, you know, commercial interest rates, many different things along these lines, right, that don't veer that much from what other countries are doing other than just the massive scale of it. But the tools for managing risk are far more different, right? You have these commodity-backed loans, basically using commodities and resources as a way to ensure you're getting paid back. Some of these accounts, for example, I mentioned sales, pre-commitments of oil, for example, undergirding these contracts. Well, essentially, how does this operate, right? You have a bank account, the money's flowing, right? The oil proceeds flow right into that bank account owned by China, and they're going to get repaid by that debt if there's a debt crisis, right? They're going to get repaid first relative to others, right? So you kind of have the structure of oil for loans, right? One way to manage sovereign risk. But they've also even managed it more administratively, right? If there's a problem, well, the government's more likely to step in. I have cross default clauses here. A lot of contracts in global finance have these clauses, but we've seen China do. For example, in Argentina, well, when there's a problem in Argentina, for example, in 2015, we had a Macri administration come in, new administration, say, we don't know about these infrastructure projects, specifically these hydroelectric plants. We don't know if they're environmentally good for Argentina. We're going to put a stay on it, right? We're going to stop these contracts until we have a better idea of whether it's environmentally good for us. What does China do during this time? They're writing lenders, setting diplomats. Hey, if you cut off these projects, we're going to cut off all the other financing in your country, right? So they're much more apt to use this administrative kind of engagement in order to ensure, right, that business and projects keep moving forward. And here's an example of a cross default clause in the case of Argentina here, saying essentially, okay, well, if you're not going to keep current on your payments in these projects, well, we can hold financing to other projects. In this case, it's with the hydroelectric plants, and it's talking about, other projects within the country like Belgrano Facility Agreement, which is their cargo railway agreement, saying, okay, this is linked to other projects, right? We're going to hold our financing if there's problems with any of these. Okay, so ultimately there's a trade-off, right? I'll be talking for probably 5 to 10 more minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. But essentially, when we're thinking about the trade-off here then between China's long-term financing and Western financing, I mentioned, right, policy conditionality, budgetary discipline, budgetary balance or surpluses is always a key part of that. Well, very interestingly, right, if you look at 3 of the biggest borrowers from China, Argentina, Ecuador, and Venezuela, if you look at what they were doing from 2000 to 2008, they largely had budgetary surpluses, even these left-of-center governments, right? Here you have the 2008 financial crisis. In the blue, you have China's financing, Chinese loans. We can see is, not surprisingly, you have a downturn. Latin America is going to want to respond to that downturn by spending more money. But beyond that initial downturn, you have a V-shaped recovery. Yet, once you have China increasing more and more loans, you have bigger and bigger budget deficits. You don't have a return to that budget discipline we had before. So one argument is, well, as you have alternative sources of financing, these countries don't have to engage as much in policy conditionality, don't have to engage in as much in kind of market-oriented policies, and can have bigger budget deficits, have, from one standpoint, more policy flexibility if you're kind of making good decisions with it, or from another standpoint, right, moral hazard if you're making bad decisions with it, right? But essentially, you don't have policy conditionality, and we actually see many governments, as a result, having higher budget deficits, getting more policy flexibility. But on the other side of it, right, as I mentioned, you get lots of commercial conditions. I mentioned 2 different kinds, and you see in this chart, the one is your normal kind of tied aid, local Chinese content, where you get, okay, you're using Chinese firms, you're going to buy Chinese machinery, etc. The gray is state-to-state loans, right? Loans between 2 governments. The black is more corporate financing from China. What we see essentially is that they have both this local content, the Chinese content, the tied aid, right, which is number 1 here. They also have these commodity-backed loans, right, a way to kind of hedge this risk, and that's the number 2 here. What you see is they're using both these kind of commercial conditions in general, right? The black has Chinese corporates in general, so they happen to be part of these deals. But when you get these state-to-state deals, there's far more of it, and particularly commodity-backed loans, right? Or far more loans that are attached to collateral from natural resources, oil, energy, things along these lines. You can see it here. Forgive me, I don't want to overwhelm you with statistics here. This is just a nice quick chart. What this is showing is China's state-to-state financing. So if you have a development fund like we talked about set up between China and Venezuela, what are the implications of that? I said, actually, right, you might have more policy flexibility. There's be lots more commercial conditions, right? They got to send oil exports. You got to send gas exports, whatever it might be, in exchange for these loans. What you see here is as China's loans increase, right, more and more, particularly state-to-state loans as this measure of overall total Chinese financing, we get more and more commercial conditions. So essentially, China using a lot of these commercial conditions, as a way to kind of protect their business, their commerce, and ensure that these loans get paid back. Okay, so now I want to kind of look at the cost and benefits broadly for Latin America from this kind of structure. Are they gaining? Are they losing out from it? And then I'll ultimately close with some specialized points about Venezuela. But in terms of benefits, I mentioned, right, a lot of the region prior to the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of developing countries in general had huge infrastructure needs, right? If you had to, during a crisis in Latin America or elsewhere, right, we know there's a lot of crises in the 80s and 90s in developing countries. You had to balance your budgets often. And the way you did it was cutting infrastructure, right? Usually trying to cut education, pensions, other things. Big polemic politically. Much better off cutting infrastructure deficits. So China coming in post-financial crisis and saying to the world, hey, we're going to help build infrastructure, right? That's a big benefit in the eyes of Latin America, right? No one's willing to build this infrastructure. We had to cut it all. Here comes China offering to help finance it. Wow. But the costs are these commercial conditions I've talked about, right? And they can kind of create a few different conditions in Latin American developing countries, right? One is, well, sometimes there's local industries. So fine, if China's going to provide things that aren't provided locally, right? So maybe in the case of turbines, you don't have turbines locally, in places like Argentina, you don't have a big turbine business. Okay. But there's if we think the cargo railway and the first deal that was done, there's a big business for railway ties, right? Basically the wooden railway tracks that the train runs along. There is a business in Argentina, but all went to China initially, right? That kind of thing can undercut local content, local business opportunities, right? Another potential problem is middle income trap, right? A lot of China FDI may be coming into countries, but for the most part, when China FDI is coming into countries, it's bigger markets like Brazil, right? In terms of what China's bringing to countries, a lot of countries would want manufacturing like this. It's happening in terms of like clean, electric buses and things like that in Brazil, not happening in a lot of other places. So you risk, increasing dependency, meaning you're giving away for all these loans, all these commodities, but then China's also selling, right, more and more capital inputs in your economy, possibly putting your own, right, manufacturing sectors in a worse place. Finally, in terms of cost, is indebtedness, right? It's fine to have more policy flexibility if you invest well. Think of a household, right? If you borrow money, not a big problem as a household. If you're investing well, right? Maybe it's education, maybe it's buying a home. If you're making decisions like that, okay, maybe you're investing well. If you're instead making decisions that aren't as productive, I guess in the case of the household, it'd be letting your teenage son fund his rock band career. Maybe it'll pan out, but who knows, right? It might be a case of moral hazard. Similar thing for many countries as well. All right. So if we then look at some of these issues and just look at some quick graphs to get a sense of what happened, you see here, this is Latin America's exports to China. Pretty much all their exports are commodities, right? So Latin America forever has wanted to diversify into manufactured goods. Well, this dotted line down here shows their manufactured good exports to China start to fall off, initially with China's WTO entry. and just increases with the global financial crisis, right? So that's already, you're seeing some of this commodity dependency, right, rear its ugly head again. Here, in terms of the middle income trap, right, again, you want to diversify. If you're Argentina, you're Brazil, lots of Latin American countries want to diversify into other sectors. But, you know, you get a lot. Look what's happening with high-tech manufacturing imports from China, right? Starts to increase a lot during from the when China joins the WTO, continues to increase to the 2008 financial crisis, right? Where high-tech manufacturing imports from the U.S. are falling off. So to some extent, they're replacing China with the U.S., but also replacing, even in the cases of places that have high-tech sectors, burgeoning kind of high-tech sectors in Latin America as well. So finally, the big cost here is also indebtedness, right? And then I'll kind of close talking about the Venezuelan case, showing some graphs in terms of Venezuela case as well. You know, Venezuela is a good example of when you do have a moral hazard problem, right? Initially, I mentioned a lot of the funds are set up very discretionary, right? So in the 2010s, Venezuela is using that financing for everything from cattle to railway to manufacturing. Once these bets kind of go awry for China, they start to have more and more stipulations, and the investment starts to flow more directly only into oil, right? Which is really kind of the key thing China wants ultimately. Now, a couple things with Venezuela, right? Normally, every time Venezuela went into financial trouble, right, it would end up going into austerity, having to tighten its books because it didn't have enough revenues and resources. With China's financing, in some ways, right, it continued to prop up some of these economic models, some of these political leaders, arguably for longer than would have been the case counterfactually without Chinese financing. But I would say it's not only Chinese financing is complicit there, Wall Street's complicit there, right? There's lots of financial actors. So I wouldn't blame China accounts for about 20% of overall financing here. So there's lots of other actors, you know, commercial banks, investment banks in the U.S., bond market activity that has also done this. The debt moratorium, because of the problems of Venezuela repaying its debt, started in 2016. And China actually, as I mentioned, hasn't wanted to be a lender of last resort. Just said, put it in a moratorium, put it aside, and it's kind of politically hedged a lot of what's happening. Over 2025, right, when China had, you know, through black markets, was receiving about 80% of oil from Venezuela, but it didn't dedicate them debt flows, right, but still, right, had this fluidity of money coming to China. So that's important in terms of the broad structure and their interest commercially in Venezuela in the long run. As I said, right, some of these loans are willing to take a long-term strategic approach to them if they know they're maintaining a commercial foothold. So they're maintaining, right, joint ventures. There's big Chinese oil companies with joint ventures there, and they're still attaining about 80% of Venezuela's oil through black markets. Obviously, following the U.S. intervention, right, in January, and following the blockade in December, Trump administration is threatening to continue this blockade, convinces, right, the remaining, you know, the Chavistas who are still in control, Delcy Rodriguez basically agrees to U.S. control of the oil. U.S. is using this rationale, as we know, kind of the Monroe Doctrine as a foreign policy paradigm there. And Venezuela is willing to do that because they're fearing there could be another blockade. And if the blockade is continued, they'll have no oil, right? So the regime would rather, right, have oil, even if it's being controlled by the United States, than have no oil at all, right? Now, Venezuela is also hedging this relationship because right away the Chinese foreign minister went, right, talked to Venezuela, and Venezuela said, hey, we're going to continue to honor your debt contracts. So China has this long-term approach, okay, we're going to get paid eventually, and kind of waiting this out. And, you know, we're kind of in a situation right now where there wasn't regime change. Perhaps the United States has learned from the past in Iraq and Afghanistan in this case. But there's also this question of how long is this equilibrium going to be able to be maintained, right? Because you still have Chavistas here who are really unpopular within Venezuela right now. So just some final graphs to close on here, and I'll open it up for questions. Just so you can see, I mentioned that China was only one of many debtors here. So this situation involves many debtors. China's in the red. By 2019, right before the pandemic, China's accounting for about 20% of all the foreign debt. So you still have a lot of other actors here, bondholders, commercial banks, etc. Also, very importantly, what's happening in Venezuela and why you can ask this question of, okay, China had a different model in Venezuela, saying they had oil, we'll secure the oil, they'll repay us oil, everything will be fine. But you see here, this is thousands of barrels per day from 2006 to 2019, right? There's not a lot of reinvestment and it's falling off, right? Even before U.S. sanctions hit, you have steep declines in oil production within Venezuela because of the crisis, the lack of reinvestment, etc. So as a result, as you can see, by 2019, there's less and less proceeds to pay creditors back, and this is why you have the debt moratorium. So in all, I look forward to your questions and Q&A. A lot of these ideas are coming from this book that was published in 2021 called Globalizing Patient Capital. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Stephen. That was great. It was fascinating, and it's a really an enormous topic right now. So I'm not quite sure if I follow exactly what you think is going to happen with the Trump administration coming in and the question of Chevron and so forth. Could you just, for the
Oh,
layman,
sure.
a little
Yeah, I
bit
was
more?
trying to, honor the time, so I didn't get into that immediately, figuring, okay, I can get into it in Q&A. But essentially, Chevron's the best place to take advantage of the situation most quickly. They never left, right? When you had a lot of political risk, Chavez nullifying contracts, etc., Exxon, Conoco had left Venezuela. So they're kind of, and I mentioned like the difference in time horizon. You have actors like that, and if you looked at actually the hearings that were online, right, you can see the Exxon president saying, okay, well, the Exxon CEO saying, okay, well, this is all good. We support the administration, but we need to have firm changes of rule of law, institutions, right? They've seen contracts nullified. They've seen political risk. They don't want to come in until the institutional framework is much different, right? So you see actors like that having really more of a long-term, like wait and see strategy. But Chevron, right, operating currently in Venezuela, stands to benefit more quickly, right? Not only from higher oil prices, but perhaps willing to kind of invest more quickly because you already have that up and moving. So I think that's one element to think of. I think more broadly in terms of the Trump administration, I mentioned, I kind of was closing that, okay, they stopped short, right? When the intervention starts, there's this question of, well, are they going to change the regime, right? We know at elections previously in the summer before, not only did the opposition win, but we also know that it's very popular, right? Within Venezuela, about 70% support of Venezuelan population. So there's this broader question of, well, what happens to democracy? What happens to institutional renewal? Where do we go with this? Because the Rodriguez administration, right, was willing to work with Trump and are willing to give U.S., right, the concession of controlling the oil, you see sort of a Trump administration happy with the status quo, right? They've kind of said, okay, yeah, we'll have elections, but the time frame is really key, right? And I think key not only from a strategic standpoint, from the U.S. standpoint, but key from a Venezuelan standpoint, right? How long are Venezuelans willing to maintain the status quo? When might Venezuelan citizens start to get more patient with the lack of democratic transition?
Stephen, a question for you. To what extent have the Chinese reacted to the fact that they're not going to be getting as much Venezuelan oil as they used to? In fact, I would think their supplies are in real jeopardy here. How have they reacted to that? Is there any way they can cajole the administration to at least provide them with a partial, supply of oil that they'd been getting in the past?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if this is an ongoing negotiation between Trump and China, right? We have the pre-summit, right, to the presidential summit that's already occurred. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's some negotiation there. I think importantly to remember is this is only about 4% of China's overall oil. So if we think of Iran and comparatively how dependent China is on Iran, you're talking about, based upon estimates, 17% to maybe as much as 20%, right, of Chinese oil coming from the Middle East, coming from Iran. So I would say geopolitically and geoeconomically, we have a bit of a different picture here, where, yeah, China wants to repay it. The loans themselves are in debt moratorium, but they still have these joint ventures that are operating, and they want to be able to recover their oil. So I think it's going to really come up to U.S.-China negotiations, as you highlighted, right? We have, since there wasn't a change of regime, right, as a result, you don't have any kind of nullification of the debt contracts, et cetera, and you have the promise of the current regime to honor, right, Chinese debt and these contracts moving forward. But I think ultimately, given U.S. posture in controlling this oil, it's going to be a negotiation between U.S. and China to some extent.
Steve, you mentioned black market a few times. What's the issue of corruption, danger, intimidation, and worse? And the drug cartels.
Yeah, so
Everybody playing in that arena?
yeah, so obviously, I mean, what's been happening economically, like there's black market, and then there's also kind of, trying to circumvent the sanctions, right? And one way that sort of the sanctions have been circumvented, where there are companies like India or other actors that were able to buy and then resell to kind of other kind of Chinese and Russian companies. So that's one way we've seen kind of that circumvention go on. In terms of, black market, this is more out of my area of specialization, but in terms of, from a security standpoint, that was also a concern of the administration, right? In terms of the different things they've highlighted, drug trade, corruption, all these things were also kind of important rationales for this intervention here. But, in terms of, sort of specific facts and figures, that's something I haven't spent as much time looking at.
Thank you.
So, Stephen, we have a question that's coming in
Sure.
from a viewer. So, given the Belt and Road investments and so on and so forth, and what you've been talking about, sort of all the strings attached, from your perspective, what practical steps can countries take to mitigate these longer-term political and economic risks so that future leaders aren't constrained by decisions made under short-term pressures?
Yeah, so one, as I alluded to earlier, is I think the United States, we're seeing more attention turning to Latin America than has been the case in recent history. So that's good to some extent, but also sort of is highlighted by this temporary equilibrium that we kind of have in Venezuela, right? And there's this question of what's going to happen ultimately. I think there's a similar question, right, in terms of what is the United States' strategic long-term position in the region, right? And when I say that, I don't only mean vis-a-vis China in terms of competition, but also in terms of what United States will offer Latin America, right? I think within the Belt and Road Initiative, you have this natural complementarity in terms of infrastructure, right? Region needs infrastructure. China's willing to provide it. Okay, there's all kinds of geopolitical questions that follow from there, but China has this development vision, right? Even if it's mostly commercial from my standpoint, it still is going to appeal to many countries, right, in the Americas, right? If you're a politician and you can build new roads or you can build new ports, you can build new infrastructure, that's going to play well domestically. So there's an interest there. I think the challenge for the United States is to also have some kind of development vision, right? I don't think the answer is providing the same infrastructure financing that China does. China has basically built their domestic economic model on enormous infrastructure and engineering capacity, right? I don't think we need to compete there. There hasn't been the appetite to compete there historically. But I think one of the things that can be more successful is we have the Development Finance Corporation that tries to encourage, right, and incentivize the private sector to move into Latin America, right? By, giving, credits or different things along these lines in order to support private business. So I think from that standpoint, thinking about, well, where are the areas of competitive advantage for the United States? And that's the way the United States should be engaging, right? So historically strong finance, banking, technology, telecommunications, right? All these areas that are an important part of our domestic economy, thinking of how we can help create opportunities for those private sector actors abroad, right? I don't think we need to answer and compete directly with the infrastructure financing, but instead offer our own development vision based upon where we have our own competitive and comparative advantages.
Stephen, further to that point, to what extent have Western lending procedures or processes reduced, or shall we say, downplayed the conditionality that apparently in the past has kind of been a hindrance to, the good guys getting the deals and the bad guys, China, scoring them?
Yeah, so a few things on that. I mean, what we've seen, I think we had June mention it in the open, so I'll kind of refer to it now. We saw an Argentine financial bailout, right, with very few conditions, right, which was really surprising, given that if you look at the recent history between the IMF and Argentina, not only has there been a long track record of conditionality through IMF program after IMF program, but Argentina has repeatedly asked for foregoing conditions, right? And the IMF was never willing to do that, right? And to then see sort of a very discretionary financial loan then given to Argentina, that's without precedent for Argentina. There is a precedent, as many of us probably know, which is Mexico in their crisis 94-95. We used U.S. Treasury funds to help bail out Mexico. Immediate neighbor, concerns about sort of what that meant economically. You don't have those same economic linkages, right, with Argentina. You could say you have strategic interests in terms of lithium, and maybe even oil, Vaca Muerta, things along these lines, from a longer term standpoint. But definitely a shift to very new tools in order to try to not only bail out Argentina, but keep a leader within Argentina that kind of saw eye to eye with the Trump administration. So we definitely, I would say that's sort of an unprecedented new tool that's being used. I think also what you see in terms of your suggesting, institutional constraints. If we have these institutions, longstanding institutions, whether World Bank, even Development Finance Corporation, to what extent are rules and conditionality holding up what those institutions will do, right? So that could spin, right? I'm kind of saying, well, you had this loan, you don't have a lot of rules or, institutions supporting it. Oh, wow, that's very new. I'm not sure about that tool, particularly in terms of how it's going to be used or whether it's repaid, right? But the other way of looking at it would be, well, maybe to compete with China, you need more flexibility, right? So if you need more flexibility, how do you create more flexibility within these institutions? So another example would then be the Development Finance Corporation, where there are conditions where it can't lend to middle income powers, right? The Argentinas and Brazils of the world. But, right, if you're most competing with China in those kind of countries, maybe you need more flexibility to do that, right? And so we're kind of seeing an ongoing debate within Congress in terms of the rules surrounding the institution of Development Finance Corporation in terms of, can you use a tool like that to compete with China more directly in bigger markets like Argentina and Brazil, not only places that are developmentally important or based upon need?
So, Steve, this is probably not your area, although I would think you have a great deal of knowledge about it. But how do you think China being so strongly in certain countries in Latin America impacts U.S. security? So for instance, in Argentina, isn't there the satellite base and the concern as to its being able to spy on the United States and possibly eventually shoot weapons at us?
Yes, I think there are these longer term national security issues. I think one thing that would be important, and I think, if we think about the degree of economic interdependence, right, it's decreased. The trade relationship, supply chains have been decoupling to some extent, but there's still a lot of economic interdependence, and far more than the Soviet Union ever had with the United States, right? So as a result, from my standpoint, you have to think of what can you negotiate on, what can't you, right? And if you take kind of a blanketed approach where, hey, we're going to object to any Chinese engagement in the Americas, I think it leaves the United States with far less flexibility strategically, right? Because one, there is a development and commercial vision that China has for the region. So many sovereign countries in Latin America want that financing to continue, want that trade relation to continue, right? So that makes it very strategically difficult to say all or nothing, right? Also, sort of a very important element from that standpoint, then too, is that okay, if you thought more of a sectoral approach, so China builds a highway in Jamaica, so what, right? Is the geopolitical stakes really that high? If there is, cargo railway in Argentina that many goods could get to port more quickly, maybe that's not so problematic. To your point, if we're talking about nuclear power, we're talking about telecommunications, right? Maybe there's other areas that are much more concerning in terms of national security. So for me, I would probably take more of a sectoral approach to competing with China in the hemisphere rather than just sort of a blanket Monroe Doctrine-esque kind of approach that just says, this is our sphere of influence. Because the problem is, I think compared to, the early 1900s, right, when you had this kind of Monroe Doctrine, you didn't have the same degree of sovereignty among Latin American nations. You're talking about nations with a lot more sovereignty that find, right, what China's doing from a trade and financing perspective appealing. So you need to have a long-term vision to compete. And that's why I think a sectoral approach, right, deciding where do we take on China, where don't we take on China, can be far more effective from my perspective.
Stephen, a question about in the past, the ill will that has been created by China's Belt and Road lending and so forth, particularly in Africa and I guess in maybe Southeast Asia. Has it kind of solved its tin ear problem in the sense that they're now treating local workforces perhaps a little more, humanely and not generating the kind of blowback that we heard so much about 5 or 10 or 15 years ago? I'm thinking of Sri Lanka, where, they were building a huge port, but the way they handled it and the general feedback from the population really was quite a negative for China.
Yeah, so I think I'll answer this question in two different dimensions, right? The first dimension being sort of the soft power issues you're highlighting, right? Like, great, you're going to build infrastructure for us, but if you're Ecuador and that infrastructure starts to show cracks, right, or there's environmental degradation, as the case is in Argentina, or if there's, risk to the local workforce and indigenous community, if we've seen in Ecuador and elsewhere, well, that's more problematic. I think one thing that's important to think about when we think about China is it's a good learner internationally, very dynamic and very aware of these soft power problems, right? And has invested in that. So they also start changing what they do, right, over time. Not only in terms of engaging bilaterally, right, and changing sort of some of the ways they behave bilaterally. One good point would be, you made the point about Africa in terms of labor. Well, it was a similar approach initially to countries like Brazil and Latin America, and there's a big pushback because you have a strong history of labor movements in places like Brazil, Argentina, and elsewhere, and a big pushback against Chinese visas and so forth, right? So in those countries, you kind of had China tried to move in a place like Brazil very early, and Brazil was like, we're not going to issue the visas, et cetera. And it was an ongoing negotiation where, okay, China starts sending more engineers, right, but not as many workers, et cetera, right? And so I think that's a good example where you see China learning in places like Latin America, or you just reference in Africa, oh, well, maybe we have to engage differently than we first thought. And the point of now, right, Brazil first objected to China's investment based upon concerns about local labor. Now President Xi visits Brazil and talks about Brazilian local labor, right? So there is a learning that's occurring within China over time. I also want to highlight, I think, just empirically, there are stories that are out there in the press that, don't always reflect the true, I would say, logical sequencing of the way things happen internationally, right? So one of those being debt trap and debt trap diplomacy. I can talk to Venezuela and then briefly talk to Sri Lanka, But sort of what we've seen historically in places like Venezuela is when, right, yes, there was this huge increase in financial ties between China and Venezuela from the 2008 financial crisis to the commodity downturn, right? Commodity downturn hits, China starts hedging its risk, right? Even before the commodity downturn, the shift from Chavez to Maduro, Chavez more of a pragmatist than Maduro, China starts hedging its risk, right? So I would say that debt trap diplomacy, from my standpoint, in Venezuela works really well with Russia, because Russia starts increasing its investment in 2019, Rosneft, etc. There's no logical commercial reason to be doing that in that kind of economic and humanitarian crisis, right? So maybe there's a commercial end, but there's also geopolitical ends. With China, they're hedging their risk beginning in 2014. It's much more of a commercial hedge far earlier, and I wouldn't call it debt trap diplomacy, right? Because in fact, they start cutting off loans once it became economically less sound, right? So I don't think you have that logic working in the Venezuela case. For me, it's China investing, right? Learning how to be an investor internationally, making wrong bets, right? Because there is so much discretion, so much investment, as I mentioned earlier, from railway to cattle to manufacturing Venezuela that went belly up. China learns from that, right? And in fact, started to cut its ties and invest in places that were a little more stable politically and economically. Even in Sri Lanka, right? Africa is not my area of expertise, but you don't ultimately have like the seizing of any assets, right? The debt trap diplomacy kind of suggests you're purposely indebting countries in order to seize key assets strategically throughout the world, but you never get that transfer of an asset, right? And so I still think the logic of debt trap diplomacy, works politically if you're trying to scare people off, right, from different regions, Latin America or Africa, but I don't think there's a lot of logic to it. Even for China, if you're making a development push internationally and you're creating this whole soft power development push to purposely indebt countries, right, that goes against everything you're trying to do, right? And so for me, I think two key things to underscore then in closing. China learns a lot. When it's done things that have been detrimental to it as an investor, it's tried to change, right? So that's something to think about, right? Because that's some of the ways that a lot of countries still seeing its investment as appealing. Two, I would call what people call a debt trap, I would call actually a creditor trap in some ways, where China's learning, making mistakes, and then, right, it has all this collateral that it at times, is negotiating with when it's not able to recover its investments, right? But I don't see as much intent, particularly in places like Venezuela.
Thank you. Can I ask one more question? I know you said in closing, and then
Sure.
we'll let you go. Cuba, what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, so Cuba, it's clear there are overtures, right? It's sort of that we have the similar kind of framework occurring, right? Where, I think the saliency of Cuba, it's always been there, but there wasn't much diplomatic conversation about it, right? And as we saw a similar thing with Venezuela, where the rhetoric, right? You amp up the rhetoric, you amp up the conversation, right? And now there's kind of this saliency of what will happen in Cuba next. So it certainly, it does seem like there's a possibility of further intervention. I think I will talk about implications in terms of the region, since that's what I know the best. And I think there's kind of a mixed set of implications as I think about this for the region, right? Because on one hand, think of the case of Maduro, right? Where, from a humanitarian standpoint, he had done so much damage to Venezuela. A lot of people wanted him out. If you think of Colombia, as was mentioned earlier in the call, and migration issues, right? There's a lot of reasons, right, to get Maduro out of power, right? And so I think on net, the fact Maduro's not there, probably there's many countries that view that beneficially on net, right? But then there's a concern about the precedent, right? You have the Monroe Doctrine, you have the history of U.S. intervention in the region, and you have the new history here, right? A lot of the history historically was in Central America, right? You had covert operations in the dirty wars in Argentina and Brazil, Chile, 70s and 80s, but all that was kind of pretty covert. The fact that you're now having open U.S. intervention in South America, that precedent, I think, is worrisome to a lot of countries, right? So I think it's kind of a similar framework. If we think of balance of risk for the rest of the region, looking at what just happened in Venezuela, looking towards Cuba, probably on net, right, if there was a change in economic and political conditions in Cuba to some extent, many, I think, leaders in the region would view that somewhat positively. But there's lots of negatives that come out, right? Because then it heightens concern about who's next, right? Does that just mean U.S. can decide where it wants to intervene, control the property and resources that it wants when it wants, right? So you got to think a lot of governments that then consider themselves to be sovereign governments and a long history of being a sovereign government all of a sudden is, well, we don't want to be next. And so I think there is the underlying conditions versus the precedent. And I think the region is really concerned about the precedent that's being developed here, even if some on net might think, oh, the transition away from a Maduro or the transition to new leadership in Cuba, maybe that could be positive. Is it worth the potential precedent that's being setting, right?
Thank you very much. June, did you have anything further? Anybody else? Any other questions in chat?
No, I think we should wrap up, but Stephen, I think you've given us a lot of, I guess you are a good teacher, so.
Oh, thank you. Thank
and
you.
hopefully
Yes,
good
you're a
students
wonderful teacher.
also.
Well, you all have wonderful questions, right? Very good questions. So yeah, very thoughtful.
No, so thank you very much, for your time and your expertise that you've shared with us. And I think we will certainly be looking at what's happening, certainly with a different lens than possibly we were before. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah. And yeah, I really enjoyed our conversation and thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. And we hope that we can have you come back again some other time.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm a New Yorker through and through. I'm a Yankee fan, Giant fan,
Oh,
right?
good for you.
Well, come see us when you're
Yeah.
in the area. So, anyway, we'll hope that this is a long-term relationship.
Well, have a
So-
great day. Oh,
Thank
sorry, you were
too.
saying.
Okay,
Well, I
thank
did
you.
want
Take
to
care.
say that we have a program that's coming up in 2 weeks on Monday, April 6th, and we will be welcoming Kelly Grieco, who is Senior Fellow at the Stimson Center, and she will be speaking on the National Defense Strategy, priorities, trade-offs, and the question of alignment. So in other words, do we have a plan? Are we following that plan? And is our military prepared for the future wars and conflicts, given the resources that we've used in the two conflicts that have been going on in Iran? So it should be a fascinating discussion and important for all of us, as this one was. So thank you very much, and we will see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you,
And-
Stephen.
Thank you.
Thank you,
June.
everybody. Have a great
Thank
day.
you.
Thank you,
Yep.
June.